Well, good morning. It is a real honor to be here. So within IDC, this summit is really well known and really well talked about because it is such a large and influential summit in the community. And so it is a real honor to be here. You know, as Sarah said, you know, they spent 11 months preparing for this, and it was over 11 months ago that they asked me to come speak. So I've been looking forward to this for a whole year, and I'm really pleased to be here. So it's been about 4.5 years since we started working with our clients at IDC around how to digitally transform their organization. And we've seen a lot. We've seen a lot that works, and we've seen a lot that isn't working. And so my goal here today is to share that with you. Share with you what is working for organizations to help speed up and help make your digital transformation a more successful transformation. So let me begin first by just sharing with you kind of some overall context for where organizations are in their digital transformation. And we're starting to actually see some nice progress that's taking place. So on a worldwide basis, we estimate there's about 46% of organizations that are what we say digitally determined. So it doesn't mean that they've digitally transformed the whole organization, but what we're saying is that they have overcome some of the really big, significant problems that we see organizations struggling with, and they look to be set up for success to do that digital transformation. And so what are some of those things that they're doing right? One is they have done a whole reboot of culture. And so this really is at the heart of this, and I'll talk a little bit later on about what that means. But they really are trying to do this transformation with a different type of culture that they're putting in place. Hand in hand with that, we've seen these organizations get aligned around a single digital strategy. And so that allows them to have much more momentum as they go forward. They've been successful in communicating to their investor community that digital transformation has inherent value, right? And so they've been able to get that funding that they've needed. And then from a technology standpoint, they are starting to move to pulling all that innovation at a technology level together into a digital platform. So by contrast, the other organizations we see are what we refer to as digitally distraught. And on a worldwide level, we see about 54% of organizations there. Their challenge is that they are trying to do this digital transformation without changing the culture or without changing even the organizational structure. And so what you see happening is that a lot of times the line of business still is driving the agenda. And so, you know, you may have a digital strategy for every line of business that you have. And therefore, the poor soul who's in charge of pulling all this together is really just trying to coordinate. And it gets pretty divided. And with that, it's oftentimes hard to articulate to the investor community, you know, why are you doing this? And so we tend to see the business cases kind of down at the project level, and you're trying to demonstrate this return on investment project by project. And those of you, you know, have gone down this path, you know that not all of these digital projects do have a good ROI, because some of this is just foundational work that needs to be done before you can get to what your ultimate goal is. We also see, you know, where there's separate digital strategies, there's separate digital roadmaps, and there's separate technology projects that have taken place. So we see this thing that we talk about as islands of innovation throughout the entire enterprise. And so again, as CIOs and IT executives, you know, you're trying to figure out how do I pull all this together, and it's really hard to get scale when you have all these various islands of innovation. So that's just a little bit of the background about where we see organizations. But what's encouraging is to see, you know, almost half of organizations worldwide are starting to really get this and become digitally determined. So I thought I'd share with you 3 examples of organizations that are digitally determined. And the first one's in healthcare. This is the first affiliated hospital of University of Science and Technology. It's based out of China. So they have really transformed and positioned themselves as a patient-centric hospital. And they're using AI to assist in their diagnosis. And you can see up here, we've got this robot here. So this medical robot performs 1,000 interactions daily, has a 90% accuracy rate. Physicians are able to dictate the medical record right into an app on their smartphone, so it's very kind of convenient, and they're able to move forward and get on to the next patient. So that's an example there in a digitally determined hospital. The other one I want to share with you is a digitally determined library. And this is Chattanooga, Tennessee library in the US. And they have really started to rethink what is the purpose of a library, what's the mission of a library. And so if you think about what they have, is they have on the second floor, they have a whole recording studio. So it has musician-grade equipment. And then on the fourth floor, they have a maker's lab. It has 3D printers, laser cutters, has a whole photography studio. And they also have a tools library. It's not software development tools, you know, it's socket wrenches and drills that you can check out. And so what's going on here in Chattanooga? What they're doing is they're starting to say, what was the mission of a library and what will be the mission of a library? And so, you know, libraries are places where we go to consume knowledge. And historically, we've thought the best way to do that is through the solitude of books. And so they're starting to challenge that and say, we think the library is a place in the community where we go and people create knowledge and they share that knowledge with each other. And so this is an example of how they're starting to really digitally transform and rethink that whole industry, if you will. Another example is Deakin University out of Australia. So they're really trying to tackle student life. And how do you manage that better? So they've created this AI-enabled personalized virtual assistant and, you know, runs on the smartphones of the students. And so the thinking behind this is that if they can help university students kind of manage their life throughout university, then they won't be overwhelmed. They will be able to continue to engage in the learning process. So I just have a quick little video here showing you what it does. But, you know, it keeps you up to date on the latest news that's going on. It also reminds you as a student of upcoming tests. Will help you with your referencing on your papers. It's voice enabled, so it will also remind you of upcoming exams that you may have verbally. It provides you with access to online resources as well. So maybe study guides that you can get access to. It also provides you with access to online other services as well within the university. And then it has a 7x24 Q&A service that can help you with as well. So I share these three examples with you, intentionally picking healthcare, libraries, education, because these aren't necessarily industries that we think of as cutting-edge industries when it comes to digital transformation. And so I wanted to show you here that, you know, we're seeing this even in industries that, you know, we don't necessarily see being threatened by some external disruptor like we see in the media industry or we see in the retail industry. And hopefully it's a bit of inspiration as well that, you know, this is something that is applicable to all industries. So the great part about being able to look at these digitally determined organizations is that we start to have a better sense for what the future enterprise will look like. And so it was about 4.5 years ago, we created our first maturity model. And our maturity model really was a digital transformation maturity model. We helped CIOs and business leaders like yourself identify what are the elements of your business, the dimensions you need to transform. And so it really is rooted in a business-first mindset. And recently, just last month, we updated this because things have changed. Now, what hasn't changed is the dimensions are still the same. It's still about transforming how you engage with customers, transforming how you take data and turn that into intelligence, transforming your operations, transforming your work and the way work gets done, and then right there at the heart of it is transforming the culture. So what's different about the future enterprise model? So what's different is really we've moved the goalposts. So things that organizations were struggling with 4.5 years ago, a lot of them are starting to tackle it. That's why we're seeing these digitally determined. And therefore, it's incumbent upon us to start to identify, well, what is the next set of things you need to be tackling to get to this future enterprise state? So what I'm going to do is I'll walk you through each one of these dimensions, and I'll show you how the goalposts have moved, and I'll show you what's working with some organizations. All right, I'm going to start with culture, because the reason I'm going to start with culture is because the biggest thing we've seen and the biggest lesson learned over the past 4.5 years is that you have to address the culture. The culture is the most important part of this. And so it's funny because, so now we get into the leadership. What is your leadership, you being leaders in your organizations and your leadership team, what do you need to be doing to make this happen? So 4.5 years ago, really, it was more a call to action. I was standing up on stage saying, okay, you have to convince your CEO that disruption is coming and that you need to get on this journey. Well, obviously, that's past, right? Obviously, we see over 80% of organizations doing some type of digital transformation. So now the message really is to the leaderships is that you have to create this culture that supports flexibility, supports collaboration throughout the organization. You have to empower your employees to make their own decisions, especially as they're engaging with your customers. And then create an organization that can readily adapt, right? Because this isn't a steady state, all right? Even when we get to that end state and we've digitally transformed and become the future enterprise, it will still continue to change. So we have to be a learning organization that can adapt. So this usually kind of brings up the question like, so who's doing this and how are they doing this? Because that's a tall order. So I like to share the example of the Bank of Singapore, DBS. And I like to share it because I think they went all in on the culture part of it. And so what they did is when they went down the path of putting forward a digital transformation journey, they went out and they studied who they wanted to be like, right? So they looked at all the startups and they went and studied Google and Netflix and Apple and really looked at like, how do they run their company? How do meetings take place? How do decisions get made? How do people work? And then they said, okay, now we understand that's what we're trying to get to as a culture. And so as you can see up here on the slide, they said, look, we want to be a 22,000 person startup. And that's because that's how many employees they had at the time. And so now they set their eyes on this big transformation of the culture and went all in on it. So I'll just highlight two things that they did that I think are worth taking away. So one is, this is a bank. This is a conservative culture. And so one of the big changes they had to do was to create more risk-taking in the organization. So they set this goal that they would have 1,000 experiments that they would do in a 1-year time frame. And they exceeded it. But this got people getting much more comfortable just taking risks and experimenting and starting to change that. They also underpin this with a very flexible training program. So, they had many modalities of training. It wasn't just, you go in the classroom and learn this. You had kind of peer training. You had online training. You had lunch and learns. And they recognized that, people learn differently. And it's not something that you just go and you take a class and now you're ready to be this new employee in the organization. That is kind of this constant dialogue that needs to take place in the company. All right, so the next dimension I want to talk about is the future of customers. And so this has changed significantly over the past 4.5 years. So when we first started on this, most organizations were kind of struggling with like, I don't even have a full view of my customer. It's sitting, all that information is sitting in multiple databases. And so remember, this is where we got the term, kind of omni-customer, where we started to get this 360 view of customers. Now, if you're still struggling with this, don't feel bad about that. I mean, there's still plenty of organizations that are working on that. But a lot of them have kind of figured that out. They have that omni view. And now they're trying to get to this next level. And we call it empathy at scale. And the reason we call that is because now organizations are starting to say, well, how do I leverage data and technology to develop this deep relationship with my customer and really understand the situation from the customer's point of view and then take the next best appropriate action. So I have a quick little story here of empathy here. And this is Lane Crawford. So Lane Crawford is a high-end luxury retailer based out of Hong Kong. And they went on their digital journey. They went got pretty committed to transforming. And they started with design thinking, and they went off and they went to understand what happens with their customer engagement, especially in the retail store. And so in their retail stores, they have styling suites. And so, someone would go into the styling suite and, they'd work with you on trying on many different outfits. And your spouse may be sitting there, helping provide some context on that. And so what they learned was that they talked to the husbands, essentially, and they were like, the coffee is terrible. They use powdered milk, and it's like instant coffee. And so what they were doing was kind of hurrying along the shopping experience because they weren't very happy sitting there and with the coffee. So here within Lane Crawford, everybody's waiting for the big innovative product that's going to come out of this design thinking. And one of the first things they did is they hired a barista, they put in a good coffee machine, and they put fresh milk in the styling suite. So I share that with you because, sometimes these can be small things we do in order to get empathy with our customers. All right, so I recognize that as soon as we start talking about the whole customer part of this, this is an IT audience, and you may very well have a situation where your marketing organization is running a lot of their own projects. They've got their own tech budget that they're spending in there, and maybe even your sales organization as well. So what do? How do you kind of get your arms around this? And you are in a very unique position to help out and take a leadership role around this. So the first thing is kind of understanding that when we talk about customer experience, it's really cutting across multiple department areas. And so that's what this picture up here is doing. It's saying that, first of all, you have to make the customer aware of your products and services. That's the whole marketing function. You then are trying to persuade the customer to buy it. That's the whole kind of sales function. You get into, depending on what it is that you're selling, but you have customers that now you need to help them get implemented, or you need to provide them with customer service. So that's your customer service function. And then you get these kind of horizontal activities that need to take place where you want to deepen that customer relationship and build trust with them. And then you want to start to collect data and be more intelligent about that customer as well. Okay, so the reality is that those typically are right now projects happening in silos, okay? And you are in a position to help those various groups within your organization figure out how to bring a whole program together. And so the best way to do this is through use cases and by helping the organization put together kind of a holistic roadmap for this transformation with your customers. So all I'm showing you here are the color-coded use cases. They go back to those various programs I just showed you, whether it's a marketing program or sales or a customer service. And so your first set of use cases should be in what we talk about as Horizon 1. These are your use cases that you can work on today, that you're taking action on. And then you want to put together on the roadmap the Horizon 2 use cases, okay? So the Horizon 2 use cases, you're starting to incubate, right, test out, run some pilots with them. And then the Horizon 3 use cases, these are kind of blue sky, right? You may not really be able to do anything about these right now. The technology may not be there, but it's really important to be able to articulate with your business partners where do we want to take this? Because it will impact some of the decisions you're making in your Horizon 1 today. It may impact some of the platforming decisions you make if you know where you're going to be headed. Now, the biggest challenge we see is that organizations oftentimes are kind of focused on just Horizon 1. They're just trying to get it done. So I think you bring two things to the table. Help them think more long-term. Help them understand what is possible. And then help them think about how to put this together holistically across the multiple functional areas. And that will get you your empathy. Now, empathy at scale really is only going to be achieved, in my opinion, through technology. I mean, what you're trying to do as an organization is create this hyper-personalized experience for your customer. And by the way, I recognize that some of you in here may be from government and from healthcare, and so, just kind of replace the word customer with, citizen or patient or student, right? It's the same concept that you're trying to engage with them on this hyper-personalized level. And to do that at scale is really going to require technology. So these are the three big buckets that I think you should be thinking about your technology in. One is this whole bucket around customer insights and intelligence. How do you gain that? And this is really getting this kind of data-based understanding of the customer. So analytics come into play here. Even visualization software is important. We have to visualize what this customer experience looks like. And then integration. We don't want to forget about this, right? We have to integrate this in with our CRM systems, with our content delivery systems, with our data management platforms as well. So that's one bucket. Second bucket is this idea of empathy is about being able to understand the customer in the context of what they're doing, right? You know, yesterday I was in the market to buy a blender. Today I'm not, because I bought it yesterday. So don't be advertising to me about blenders still today, because I already did that. So you have to understand that real-time change of the customer. And so, you know, social listening comes into play here. So does the whole issue of privacy, right? So now you're storing this personal data about your customers, and you have this responsibility to be compliant with the governance that's coming around, but you also need to be able to develop a relationship of trust with your customers as well, and that they trust that you're going to use that personal data about them for good. And then lastly, now you get into, okay, engagement, right? Now we understand the customer, we understand the context, now we're ready to go and engage with them. And the engagement part, you know, is where you get into all of your digital marketing programs that are taking place there. So think about your investments kind of in those three buckets as you work across the multiple areas. All right, the other dimension here is really looking at the future of intelligence. So whereas I said the first two had changed dramatically, this one hasn't changed so much in the past 4.5 years. It's just expanded. So really, you know, 4.5 years ago, we were asking the same question: how do we gain insight into take the data and turn it into insight? But it used to be just around one area. We're looking at operational insight, or we're looking at customer insight. Now we're trying to say, how do we do this across the entire enterprise? How do we kind of infuse the collective intelligence that we're gathering into the work, into the operations, into our experiences? Okay, so it's just taking the idea and now trying to scale it up. So I recognize that AI now comes into the whole conversation. I'm sure a lot of you are experimenting with AI, or you're feeling pressured to do something with AI. And one of the things we've done with our customers is we've really tried to help them think through, how do you want to automate this, right? And so I'm going to walk you through a model here that will hopefully help you think through this. But the very first thing we have to kind of think about is that there are really waves of automation, okay? So it's a spectrum that we're talking about. It's not one or the other. And so the very first thing you have to ask in your organization is, you know, who's going to produce the insights, who's going to decide what gets done, and who's going to take action on that. And we can kind of pivot this as human versus machine, right? So who's going to do each one of those activities? Now, historically, it's all been human-led. And, you know, I'm the chief research officer at IDC. So, you know, a task that I may do is that, you know, I may, using limited IT, maybe an Excel spreadsheet, look at all the documents that we publish throughout the organization. And in reviewing that, I may have an insight, okay? And then based on my personal experience in 21 years of being an analyst, I may make a decision about what we should do about this insight I just had in reviewing all of our documents published. And then I decide what to do, or I delegate it to someone on my team to take some action. Okay, so that's kind of how it's been done. So now we introduce the machine, right? And so now maybe it's still very heavily human-led. Now we have a portfolio of tools. Now maybe the machine gives me some recommendations. It isn't just about Meredith's personal experience. It's about some data and fact-based information that will help inform my decision. And then, but ultimately, I'm still deciding what gets done. So where we really kind of switch over is where we start to have like the machine lead more of this. And this is kind of just the period where we are, where we're starting to evaluate this and grapple with some of the issues associated with it. So now maybe the machine is giving me insights. I still am making the decision, but maybe it's now based on these kind of fully optimized prescriptions because we've learned as an organization. And then, you know, the machine's, you know, executing this, but there still is human insight. So the next stage is really where the machine really starts to take over, okay? And so, but it still has this kind of governance and guidance around it. The machine is producing the insights, but the humans are still governing it. The machine is deciding what to do, but it's based on a governance network that we've created. And then the machine is taking action, but it still has this human oversight. And so that's kind of where we're headed in many areas. Now, the last one is, machine straight down, okay? So now we can think about our favorite science fiction movie. Is it HAL, Skynet, Agent Smith, or my favorite, the Cylons in Battlestar Galactica, okay? So this is far out, okay? This is like 2050. This is beyond even our planning horizons that we do at IDC. It completes it. I think sometimes we jump from where we are today all the way out to that. And the reality is there's a whole wave in between. So let me just show you what you do with this, okay? So now you kind of understand the flavors of this. So in every one of your organizations, you've got tasks, you have activities, you have processes, and you have systems. So start to map this out. Say, which tasks do I want to automate? And today and tomorrow. And so we actually did this with healthcare. So our healthcare team took healthcare use cases, and then they mapped them. And some of these use cases are Horizon 1, and some are Horizon 3, and they started to map them. And so this is what I'm recommending you do, is you start to look at your organization and start to recognize, by the way, industry by industry, it's going to vary because you're dealing with different types of outcomes, right? And start to map that out. And that's how I think a way to be more kind of systematic about building your roadmap around AI-based automation. Future of operations. So this one's kind of like intelligence. The goalposts have moved, but it hasn't changed dramatically. 4.5 years ago, especially those of you who may be in the manufacturing or some of the industrial industries, very much focused on, how do we apply technology, in the case a lot of IoT technology and sensors, to make our organization more responsive, okay? So today, we're just trying to take that further and say, so how can we do more agile decision-making and rapid decision-making by having kind of more closed-loop models, connecting the information we're getting from our operational systems to our decision-making systems. And let me just show you, if you are in one of these industrial industries where you have, operational technology, I think this is your issue you're going to be facing for the next 3 to 5 years, is this convergence of IT and OT. This is a survey that we've been doing for a number of years, and suddenly we saw the right-hand side pop in the past year. So pretty much it's a governance question, and we've asked, between IT and OT, do you have segregation? Is it coordinated governance, or is it integrated governance? And what's it today in green, in blue is where do you want it to go? So the fact that almost 58% of organizations say, we want this to be integrated, that's what popped. We didn't see that in the past, that many organizations. And I think what's going on is that we're getting to this point where you have all of this operational technology that maybe you've put sensors on, you're collecting this operational data, and you're starting to try to figure out, well, how do we bring that back into our decision-making systems? And so, this is kind of a simplified version of a maturity model we have that talks about kind of the journey that you'd be taking. So you today may be pretty ad hoc or opportunistic with this. And so what we mean by that is, today you may have IT and OT, and they're pretty separate silos, and you probably have created these increasingly complex workflows between the two. Maybe you've tried to kind of coordinate them, but you're still probably manually moving data that's collected in the operational transactional systems over into your decision-making systems. And where you really want to try to get to is some type of you can have separate IT and OT, but you have some type of common decision-making platform. And then where you can take it from there is really getting into this more closed-loop decision model. So the last stage here really says, okay, IT and OT are one organization, right? The one right before it says they're still separate organizations, but the information that's being collected on the operational side immediately connects into the decision-making systems so that this is kind of this closed-loop idea of making decisions. I mean, ultimately, especially those of you who are manufacturers or maybe in the utility industry, ultimately you can get to self-healing, self-optimizing systems if you have that, right? If it's automatically programmed in that when this fails, certain actions are taken, right? And so that's kind of where you're headed, and that's the benefit going forward. But we know, I mean, we work with both the IT organizations and the OT organizations, and we understand there's a long journey to go between even getting those two organizations kind of talking and working with each other. And so if you're struggling with that, you're not alone. This is a kind of workflow technology discussion, but we also understand there's just an organizational kind of culture discussion as well. Lastly, future work. Now, this has changed in priority massively in the past 4.5 years. So we had this model in the past. We called it WorkSource. And nobody was interested in it. When we talked about this with our clients, maybe some were interested, but they were mainly thinking about how do I just connect my employees, get them to collaborate better. Now, this has really become much more up-leveled, much more bigger picture here, saying how do we take this enterprise approach to transforming the concept of work and how work is done? And how do we use technology to create this dynamic, this productive, this empowered workforce? So really, I mean, it's now really taken a much bigger vision. And so, the analyst in me is like, what happened? Why is this suddenly important? And I think what's gone on is it's all about talent right now and the pain that you're feeling getting access to the digital skills that you need as you go down this digital journey. And this is from a skills study that we do. These are top 5 skills required for the IT organization. I don't think there's any surprise here for any of you, except number 5. I highlighted that one because, there's a new leadership model, right? If you think about how you're changing your IT organization, how you're becoming more customer-centric as an IT organization, how you're maybe introducing DevOps, you're being more agile, that requires a different leadership skill set that you need to bring to the table. And so you need to retrain your current leadership or maybe even bring in some new skills. But the bottom line is the top 4 are very kind of the pain we've been feeling, right? These are skills that are in short supply, and it's no big surprise that 70% of organizations say we're having a hard time sourcing talent for that. So if we start with that's the challenge that you're facing, then we get to, well, what are organizations doing about that? And they're doing 2 things. They're going out and they're bringing in talent from the outside, and they're reskilling their existing workforce, because there's not enough talent you can bring in right now from the outside. So it has to be both, okay? So this leads us to this whole rise in the employee experience, all right? And so what we see is now, and this is from our Future of Work study that we did, is that 58% of organizations say we're interested in workplace transformation because we want to create a higher employee engagement and experience. Because if you're going to go through the trouble of bringing this talent in or reskilling the talent, you need to hold on to them. And so you need to start to understand what does this group of employees need and want in order to feel engaged and to stay with the organization. So that gets us to this future of work. And we think of future of work as having these 3 components to it. There's the culture part, which is saying, how do we attract or reskill and retain the type of digital skills or the type of talent that's aligned with our digital transformation initiative. And so that gets us into what type of culture are we trying to build and keep them engaged. The space part really says, how is work getting done? Okay, how are we collaborating? How are we thinking about work independent of time and place, okay? So that we don't all have to sit within the same 4 walls to get the work done. And then the 4th part is that whole discussion about humans and machines working together and what does that future look like. So we were really interested in our future work study that we did to understand the priority around this. So we asked organizations, which one of these are you focused on this year? And so you can see up there, 47% of organizations are really focused on how do we create this engaged and empowered workers that are aligned with the new digital skills. And so this is kind of getting back to what the problem is, right? And organizations are really figuring out how do we address that. Then they get into how do we create this connected, this secure work environment that is independent of place and time. And then third is the whole collaboration between humans and technology. So I know third gets a lot of the press attention right now, but the reality is like we're just trying to bring the talent into the organization. Companies aren't kind of at that point of thinking about how to replace everyone's jobs with robots. They're really just figuring out how to get the work done. So this is a really important place where you can take a leadership role within your organization, because behind each one of these dimensions, there is a lot of technology that needs to take place. So up there in culture, we have, talent acquisition platforms like, market recruitment platforms that you need to be tapped into, talent marketplaces, talent development, how are you going to reskill and what type of investments are you making around that? And then the talent retention are kind of our classic HR systems that we've had in place. On the space, there's all sorts of investments around connectivity, right, from conferencing and UCC. Digital assistants, Liberty Mutual is an insurance company headquartered in the US. They've created this digital assistant within their organization to help their agents do a more effective job going forward. They're actually now out there selling that as a third-party product offering. And then how do we collaborate and how do we manage the content among our employees? So you get into enterprise social networks and content management. And then smart facilities. This is a big part, right? As I said, you were going to be working with OT. You're also going to be working a lot with the facilities management part of your organization as well to carry that out. And then lastly, when you get into this third dimension here about force, yes, this is where the robots come in, but there's also AR, VR to augment the work that's being done, especially, some of the early use cases are in like health and safety. In order to help especially in manufacturing and oil and gas and utilities, to help augment the workers' experience. And this is where RPA fits in as well, okay? Or IPA is intelligent process automation, another name for it as well. So here's the challenge right now on this. So 37% of organizations say we lack a budget for this. You can see the budget sits between navy blue, IT, and HR, the other blue up there. So that's where most of the budget's sitting. The advice I have for you is that it's really important to talk within your organization about this as workplace transformation. Speak about it holistically, because ultimately that's what you want, the green box. You want to get a dedicated workplace transformation budget. And that means that you have to help educate folks that this isn't just about putting video conferencing in. This is about having a vision for how work will change within our organization. Okay, how and why? Because we want to attract the talent. We want to retain the talent. There's a war for talent here. This will lead to a competitive advantage if we can get this right. And I think if you can sell it up at that level and then help build out the use cases within each one of those dimensions so that you can figure out which is one that's going to be most important, that's what's going to help build that budget at more of a pan-enterprise level. Okay, so last part here, we have walked you through the future enterprise, and I just have 3 points I want to share with you as I wrap up here. So the first one is that this is paying off, okay? So I know this has been one of the big questions going forward is, does it really pay off? There's a lot of money being spent on digital transformation. So what we did here is we took about 400 global manufacturers, and through a definition and methodology, we divided them into digital manufacturers and non-digital manufacturers. And then we looked at their financial performance over a 4-year period, and we were able to see that manufacturers who are digital grew their revenue, grew their profit. Those who were not experienced declining revenue, declining profit over that period. So we've done the same study with retailers. We are currently doing the same study with and with banks as well, and the pattern is the same. Okay, so we're going to march through all the industries, and then we'll come back and we'll show you how it all ties together. But I think the early indicators are saying that we now have some proof points to say that this isn't just a big money pit that we're throwing our money into. it does make a difference at a business level, at a competitive level. So that's point number one. Second point is that where's this all headed? Okay, so I started off showing you some examples, right, of companies who are digitally determined. And so the very first thing we do is we are going to transform our enterprise. We're going to create this future enterprise that we work in, okay? Then, as we're doing that, we're starting to reshape our industry. Just like Chattanooga, Tennessee Library starts to reshape the mission and the purpose of libraries. The next step on this journey is starting to reconfigure those industries into these new digital economies. So an example there is the auto passenger economy. So historically, manufacturers have thought about their ecosystem and their value chain as all of the supplies that make up making a car, okay? And then there's the distribution of the vehicle out to the market, right, through dealerships and ultimately to us as customers. But that's essentially the value chain. In the future, auto manufacturers are going to be looking at how do I monetize the passenger experience, okay? So now they're looking at an ecosystem with advertisers, with entertainment, with transportation services companies, along with their manufacturing. So these industries that have started to transform start to reconfigure into these digital economies. There's the microgrid economy, which is, if you're in the utility space, becomes prominent. The last mile economy around the whole delivery element, and the open banking economy as well, for those of you in financial services. So this is where we're headed. Okay, and then last point is we talked about all of the kind of interesting technologies that are needed for this transformation. And we're all technologists, and we all like technology, and that's why we're in our careers. But this is a quote from Soren, who's the managing director at Al Awwal Bank, which is a bank in Saudi that is digitally transforming. And he says the best digital transformation strategies start with people, not with technology. And as I said earlier on, one of the biggest lessons we've learned and seen is that it is really about changing the culture. So let's not forget the people part of this and leave out that and get so enamored with the technology. Let's start with the people element of it and then figure out how the technology supports them and ultimately supports the business transformation. So I appreciate your time in listening to this. At this point, Sarah's gonna come back up and we're gonna have a little time for some Q&A. So I think this is where you're gonna use your mobile app there.
Thanks, Meredith. That was fantastic. I love the way you wove the people and the technology together. That was really cool. And to hear some of those offshore examples as well was fantastic. We have got a number of questions that have come through the Mobi site. So as I said earlier, please jump on, ask the questions. We've got a really nice chunk of time now with Meredith to kind of dive into some of those topics. So I just wanted to start with a question on the leadership models that you spoke about. And I was really intrigued to see that, what the sector is saying is we need a budget. And one thing that I'm hearing from organisations is I don't have time to take out to learn and develop these new skills and new models of leadership. How are you seeing that play out in the organisations that are really winning and how they're investing in their people and how they're balancing that need to take, you've got to take time out to learn and how that's fitting in a future organisation? Yeah,
and I think we were doing a dinner last night as well and talking with CIOs about this. And we really, to some points you were making earlier about leadership, right? You're all leaders here in this room, and you're going to be bringing your employees along on this journey. And, maybe a third of them are going to immediately jump at this and say, this is exciting. And maybe a third are going to kind of sit on the side and, sort of go along with it, but not going to necessarily be enthusiastic about it. And then, there may be a third that you're just going to lose, that they are not going to be interested in making the change. And the reality is that you kind of need them all, right? But the reality is, you may just lose some of them. But you really want to be figuring out how do I bring them all along on this journey? And I think that's one of the organizations that are kind of doing the best job leading their organization through change are really being very open and transparent about we're here, we need to get to this new destination. These are going to be the things that I'm going to need you to do to change. But also being realistic, like at the end of the day, you're either going to be on board or you're not going to be on board. And if you're not on board, you've got to exit the organization, because we can't have kind of people who are naysaying and sabotaging it, because it will just slow it up. And so kind of being pretty direct about that, about if you want to be on this journey, we will support you, we will help you come along. But if you don't, it may be time not to be part of the organization. And that's what I've heard many CIOs just having to kind of have that real blunt conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that touches on the topic that you sort of focused on last in your sort of quadrants around the future of work. So, we're talking about increased collaboration, different structures, yet basically the way work looks is not that different to how it looked, 50 years ago. We all go to an office. It's basically 9 to 5. We're expected to get paid for 40 hours a week and work a whole lot more. Yeah. How are you seeing organizations tackle some of those structural challenges?
Yeah, so there's a lot of kind of just kind of physical change in workplaces going on as well. And so you see this kind of rise of like co-working spaces. Mm-hmm. And so, co-working spaces kind of was this idea a lot that kind of was born in startups, right? And, you're a startup, there's a cheaper way to go to a shared center where you are using common, resources from the building manager, and you're in there with other folks as well. Well, we're now seeing established organizations using those as well, and starting to say, hey, we kind of need to pull out people, put them in these centers. And it's not just a cost play. I mean, it's like, because it's a little more innovative workspace, it's a little more flexible. And so we're seeing some of that on the rise. And then we're also seeing organizations just kind of rethinking their physical space right within their own building that they have, and starting to say, okay, how do we maybe create a more open, collaborative space? How do we set up neighborhoods as a concept that, you may kind of be in a quiet neighborhood, or you may have neighborhoods based on the teams and the departments of work that's trying to get done. So I think the physical part of this shouldn't be underlooked. And that's why I said I think you're going to partner a lot with facilities management as well, as well as the HR department on this.
Yeah, and the environment is a really interesting one. I'm sure I heard a lot of chuckles in the audience when we were looking at the example of the high-end retailer and the chair. I mean, I know for one, my partner, when we go shopping, he's like, there's the guy chair. I'm just going to sit there next to the other guys in the shop. So I'm going to move now to one of the questions which is getting a lot of votes on the Moby site. And again, on this kind of theme of how we get people along for the journey. So in an organisation where there are a majority of non-IT savvy staff, how do we motivate people to adopt digital? So, I guess this sort of digital resistance organisation that you were talking about at the start, how do we get people on that journey?
Oh, that's interesting. So folks are seeing a lot of the non-technical people not wanting to change. Yeah. I think it's probably back to a lot of your kind of classic IT, projects and wisdom that you've all learned over the years about, you don't just take it, do the project, dump it over there, and, give them some training and hope that they adopt it. I mean, you really have to make this part of the dialogue. And I think some of the best digital transformations, start with the leadership team at the top, really messaging that this is what's important. And this is why I was saying earlier that, it starts with culture, because a lot of the digitally distraught organizations are trying to do this bottom up, right? And so it may be one functional area or IT that's saying we need to change. And if you don't have the senior management team saying, no, we need to change, you hit some point where you just get stuck, where you have these kind of technology resistors who don't want to change, or you have these fiefdoms within your organizations who are like, I'm not giving up my political power that I have here. And so you do need that top-down air cover. And so I think to the question here is, if you have that, then you're setting the tone with the employees, again, about this is where we are, this is how we need to change. And why are we changing? Because this is about the survival of our company. And therefore, you may be uncomfortable having to use some of this new technology, but you need to adopt it. And I think that's probably the most effective way of doing that. I mean, obviously, you have all your kind of classic ways of reinforcing that through ongoing, train of trainers and peer connections and supporting it that way, but you do need that top-down messaging.
And I think this is one of the challenges, particularly for established organisations who have to do that process of unlearning before they can get into the learning and kind of discard those legacy ways. And this is kind of a really interesting question, and I'm sure many of us in the room have come across this. How do you go about changing a culture without using that word? Because that can become a bit of a touchy subject. People can fiercely protect the culture that they have and not necessarily want to change it. Have you got any tips, or have you seen any organisations who are doing this really well?
Yeah, so I mean, again, that is it, right? People work for the company because, a lot of times they like that culture, and it's reinforced what they personally believe in, and that's why they've stayed in that role. And so as you're looking to change that, you're threatening that. You're threatening what makes people comfortable. And so, again, not to sound like a broken record, but it does kind of start with the top and top-down messaging about that. But it also, you need to be able to provide people with the tools to make that transformation and to be successful in it. And, communication, over-communication in any change management project is really important in this. And celebrating the wins. We've seen, we've worked with organizations who are doing DevOps projects. And, right, within the IT organization, this is a big kind of transformation. And so the ones who have done that have, formally announced, we're introducing this DevOps. They have had regular meetings where they communicate to everyone, how are we doing on this transformation? They celebrate those who have done well on that. And they've over-communicated. And so it's kind of that basic kind of change management activities that you're doing that, it's not rocket science, but it's just the ability to kind of execute on that and just keep everybody informed. I think this idea of transparency is so important in this digital transformation, because at the end of the day, people may feel threatened, right? And feel like, well, I've always done my job one way and I've been successful, and now you're asking me to change it. Will I not be successful in the future? Will I not have a job? So the more you can communicate to them, this is our goal. Our goal is not to replace you. Our goal is to bring you along on this journey. And as long as you're committed, we're committed to you.
Trust is a really interesting one. I was reading recently that the philosophers, the Greek philosophers would have thought robots taking our jobs would be a great thing, because actually, we didn't identify so closely, our work and our identity weren't so closely linked, and now they are. Actually, the fear of potentially losing our work is really quite terrifying. And I'm going to change tack a little bit and ask you one of the questions that has come through around trust in technology. So this is an interesting one. Is developing trust in AI-enabled systems and services evenly distributed across generations? So do you see younger generations forgetting the needs of the aging population? They're thinking about things like the audio-visual interaction and how older generations might be using it. What are you seeing in terms of generational acceptance of?
Yeah, so absolutely there's a difference by generation. We do a number of global consumer studies where we break it all down by age. And the questions, you absolutely see a difference between them. On questions like, are organizations collecting too much of my privacy, my personal data, on the topic of privacy? That absolutely, as you go up in generation, the answer is yes, as it increases. Though that said, there is now a growing consumer sentiment that they are collecting too much. 70% on average across all generations are concerned that organizations are collecting too much personal data. And now this issue of privacy has come into play about, can I trust my organization to handle that private personal information? And this, I think, and you were saying this in your opening statements, this is going to be the way that you're going to have to compete on your brand going forward, is you have to be this trustworthy organization going forward. And the challenge is that, the way we see trust is, it's like a hierarchical pyramid. At the base is just kind of an assumption that you have the risk associated with your IT systems under control, and then you have the risk associated with your partner's IT systems under control. And then you can get into the trust part, like, and then am I managing the personal data of my customers well? And am I organizationally committed to supporting and being a trustworthy organization? And so the challenge is that 80% of organizations are really just struggling to run a good security program and get out of kind of a defensive mode and get into more of a proactive mode. So the bar is increasing with this whole trust discussion, but some of the fundamentals we still really have to be tackling.
And we've just got a minute left, and I mean, as you said, we were talking about this earlier today. Are you seeing organisations say, actually, I don't want to hold customer data anymore? There's far too much risk in this, and the GDPR or whatever they might be, those rules and regulations. How are you seeing? Are you seeing a bit of a shift to sort of get that data away from me being responsible for it?
I think the sentiment is there. I don't think the action there is there yet on how to get away. But you're right. I mean, when we kind of over-collect information. And so, we may need to make one decision, but we wind up, kind of inadvertently collecting a lot of other information to support that one decision. And I think that will be kind of a trend going forward is, how do we just kind of do that and move on and not store this? But we're not seeing movement on that at all
No
yet.
data as a service yet.
No. It's we're a long ways off from that, but I think that is the right sentiment, is to try to figure out how to get away from that.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed having this conversation with you. It's been an absolute honour to be on the couch with you, and thank you for all of the great questions that came through. I was constantly seeing the screen refresh, so I'm glad to see that's working well for everyone. Right. Would you please join me in giving Meredith a very warm welcome and a thank you?
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks, Meredith.